Well, I don't have to tell you, the current presidential election has been one of the most eventful cycles we have ever seen. But there are some memorable moments from elections past, too. We want to look back as we look ahead. Remember the hanging chads? That caused a huge controversy and a recount back in 2000. I want to bring in presidential historian Doug Weed. Doug, good to see you.
Hey, good to see you, Maria.
Tell us about that historic election back in 2000 when George W. Bush was running against Al Gore. And there was this problem with the Florida ballots.
Wow, that was the most controversial election, bar none, of all of American history. Gore actually won the national popular vote, but lost in the Electoral College. First time that had happened since Samuel Tilden in 1876. And the electoral map came down to Florida. Watch out for Florida. And what complicated matters was each congressional district had their own type of ballot, and each congressional district had their own system for tabulating those ballots. So the first count, Gore actually won, but there was an automatic recount because it was so close. Bush won the recount, another recount, the tiebreaker. Bush won that, but the margin was even tinier, just a few hundred votes. So it went into the courts, went all the way to the Supreme Court, where they decided in Bush's favor. But some of those justices on the Supreme Court had been appointed by Bush's father, so it was controversial.
Wow. So how long did all of that take? When they went back, they did a recount. How long until we actually knew? Do you remember?
Well, it was just a matter of weeks.
Okay.
It happened very, very quickly.
Yeah.
The process was sped up.
Incredible. So then talk to us about the 1948 election. That was Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey, when the Chicago Daily Tribune printed the wrong headline. Look at this. Dewey defeats Truman was the headline. It was wrong. What happened there?
Look, that's an iconic moment in history, not just presidential history. Truman was on his way back to Washington from Kansas City. The train stopped in St. Louis at Union Station. Someone handed him the Tribune. He held it up, and the flashbulbs started popping. That election was also much closer than people thought. The electoral map shows favored Truman the way it favors Hillary now, and he won 383 electoral votes to 115. That doesn't tell the story, because there were three candidates really in the race. It was actually a 1% difference between Dewey and Truman that would have turned the election in Illinois, California, and Ohio. So it was much closer than people realize, and you can give the Chicago Tribune, the Daily Tribune then, a break for its bad call.
That sure was. All right, so fast forward to 1960. Richard Nixon and JFK, the New York Times almost made the same mistake. The Chicago Daily Tribune, incredible. Shouldn't they have learned their lesson?
Well, they wanted to get ahead of the curve and be the first paper out. So the managing editor of the New York Times wrote in his memoirs that he approved the headline that said Kennedy elected. But as he was going to bed that night, he was saying he was hoping that a certain mayor in the Midwest would, quote, steal, end quote, enough votes to not make the New York Times look like the Chicago Tribune. That was a close election. I went to bed that night, Maria, at 5 a.m. and California was Kennedy's. I woke up in the morning and they had counted the absentee ballots, and California flipped to Nixon, and Hawaii, they were still counting. Kennedy eventually won by 115 votes.
Oh, my God.
So it was a razor-thin election.
Well, it feels like we're that close again, right, guys? The Dagen, McDowell, Anthony Scaramucci, Katherine Timpf with me this morning. It could be that close this time around.
People who basically call elections for a living, like in the past, have said that it's kind of hour to hour at this point in terms of what they're willing to commit to, and in terms of Hillary Clinton's chances over Donald Trump's at this point. But it's even you as a Trump supporter, you'll admit it's more narrow for Trump in terms of the electoral college victory.
There's no question that the path is more narrow, just because the Republicans have ceded the west coast of the United States and primarily the northeastern coast when you think of the states. But one thing I'd like to ask, sir, if Mr. Trump wins the popular vote, which some people think may be a possibility, but loses the Electoral College, when has that happened in the past? I believe it's happened once or twice.
Yes, well, Anthony, it happened, as we just were mentioning, in 2000 with Bush and Gore, and it happened in 1876 when Samuel Tilden won the popular vote. But to let you know how coming second or coming close doesn't matter, you can Google Tilden, and up will come a grade school named after him. It won't even come up his name. You have to put in Samuel Tilden. So Google, like all the rest of us, doesn't pay much attention to who comes close.
Wow, really interesting stuff. Doug, good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria.
Doug Lee joining us there to look back as we look ahead. Coming up next, Saturday Night Live, getting in the last round of laughs before Election Day. Comedian and SNL alum Joe Piscopo joins us in the next hour of Mornings with Maria. Take a look at politics and comedy. Back in a minute.